On December 15th, 1967, people crossed the Silver Bridge the way they had crossed it for years. There was no storm rolling in, no warning siren, no visible sign that anything was about to go wrong. It was late afternoon in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the kind of hour when traffic thickens quietly. People were heading home from work, running errands, moving between West Virginia and Ohio the way they always had. Cars filled the bridge, engines idled, the river moved below, cold and indifferent. Then, in less than a minute, the structure gave way. A bridge that had carried thousands of people simply collapsed beneath them. What makes this story so disturbing is not only the speed of it, it is the normalcy that came before. There was no dramatic countdown, no obvious final moment, just an ordinary American day, interrupted by a failure almost no one expected, and that many did not survive. The Silver Bridge disaster became one of the most important bridge failures in modern American history. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the most famous, but because it forced the country to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes catastrophe does not begin with chaos. Sometimes it begins with routine. And what investigators discovered afterward changed how America looked at its own infrastructure forever. In the next part, we have to understand what the Silver Bridge was, where it stood, and why it mattered so much before it fell. The Silver Bridge connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, across the Ohio River. When it opened in 1928, it was seen as a modern achievement, a suspension bridge designed to carry people, goods, and daily life between two river communities whose identities were tied to movement, trade, and routine. Its name came from the aluminum-colored paint that gave the bridge a brighter, more polished appearance than the darker steel structures people were used to seeing. To local residents, it was more than a piece of engineering. It was part of the rhythm of the region. People crossed it for work, shopping, family visits, deliveries, and school events. It did not feel like a landmark in the dramatic sense. It felt dependable, almost invisible in its familiarity. But the America that built the Silver Bridge in the late 1920s was not the same America using it in 1967. When the bridge was designed, vehicles were smaller, lighter, and less numerous. By the 1950s and 1960s, traffic patterns had changed dramatically. Cars were heavier, commercial transport had increased. Holiday traffic could stack vehicles bumper to bumper. Like many structures across the country, the bridge remained in service while the world around it changed faster than its original design assumptions. And that is part of what makes this story so American. The Silver Bridge stood in a country built on expansion, mobility, and trust in infrastructure: roads, railways, dams, tunnels, bridges. These systems were expected to hold. Most of the time, they did. Which is why, by December 1967, almost no one crossing that bridge was thinking about its age, its design, or its limits. They were simply trying to get home. And that ordinary expectation is exactly what makes what happened next so haunting. By the late 1960s, the Silver Bridge had become a victim of its own usefulness. It was carrying far more weight than the engineers of 1928 could have realistically anticipated. What had once been a modern crossing was now part of a busier, heavier, faster America. Long lines of cars were no longer unusual, especially during peak travel periods. On some days, traffic backed up across the span as drivers waited to move between West Virginia and Ohio, often with little thought about the structure beneath them. To the public, the bridge still looked functional. It still stood over the river. It still connected two communities that depended on it. And in everyday life, visible survival often gets mistaken for safety. If something has always been there, people begin to believe it will remain there. But beneath that sense of routine was a more fragile reality. The Silver Bridge had been built with a design that differed from many other suspension bridges. One of its most distinctive features was the use of eye-bar chains instead of the thicker cable systems more people associate with large suspension structures. The design was elegant and efficient for its time, but it also meant that a failure in a critical component could carry devastating consequences. There was another problem, quieter but equally important. Inspection standards in mid-century America were not what they would later become. Many aging bridges across the country remained in service without the kind of rigorous, modern evaluation that people today might assume had always existed. Nothing about that made the Silver Bridge look doomed in the public imagination. There was no broad panic, no famous warning campaign, no daily headline telling people to stay away. There was only a structure growing older under increasing demand, and a nation still learning that age, stress, and invisibility can become dangerous when they overlap. And by December of 1967, those pressures were about to converge in the most irreversible way possible. December 15th, 1967 was a Friday, and not just any Friday. It was the holiday season, one of the busiest shopping periods of the year. By late afternoon, traffic on the Silver Bridge had thickened into the kind of slow, compressed movement that often feels irritating but ordinary. Cars filled the roadway, drivers waited in lines, families, workers, and shoppers sat inside vehicles with heaters running, inching forward over the Ohio River. From the outside, nothing about the scene suggested that the bridge was approaching failure. That is what makes the Silver Bridge disaster so unsettling even now. The danger was not dramatic, it was structural. Hidden inside metal components too small for the public to think about and too obscure for most people to imagine as points of catastrophic weakness. The bridge did not need a collision, a flood, or a violent storm. It only needed the wrong stress at the wrong moment inside a system with too little redundancy. And that detail matters. Many structures can absorb damage because they are designed with backup capacity, ways to redistribute force when one part weakens. But the Silver Bridge had a vulnerability that would later become central to the investigation. Certain critical components had far less margin for error than people realized. If one failed, there were limited ways for the system to compensate. The bridge had carried years of traffic, years of vibration, years of changing vehicle loads. It had remained standing long enough to seem trustworthy. But endurance can create its own illusion. The longer something survives, the easier it becomes to assume survival is proof of strength, rather than proof that failure simply has not happened yet. By late that afternoon, dozens of vehicles were crowding the span. Many of the people inside them were thinking about weekend plans, shopping bags, dinner, or the drive home. What almost none of them could have known was that the line between routine and disaster had already become dangerously thin, and that the collapse, when it came, would leave almost no time to react. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Silver Bridge failed. Witnesses later described a sound like metal snapping, sharp, sudden, unnatural. Then the structure began to give way. In a matter of seconds, the bridge's stability was lost, and the span collapsed into the Ohio River below. Vehicles that had been sitting in traffic had almost no opportunity to escape. Many were pulled down with the bridge itself, falling into freezing water along with steel, concrete, and debris. The speed of the collapse became one of the most haunting aspects of the disaster. This was not a long, visible unraveling that gave people time to understand what was happening. It was abrupt. The bridge that had supported ordinary movement one moment was simply gone the next. A total of 46 people lost their lives. 2 bodies were never recovered. For the communities on both sides of the river, the scene was almost impossible to process. Drivers who had not yet reached the center of the span stopped in shock. Witnesses along the shoreline looked toward a section of river that moments earlier had held one of the region's most familiar structures. Rescue efforts began quickly, but conditions were brutal. The water was cold, visibility was poor. Twisted wreckage made access difficult. What had collapsed was not just steel, it was a piece of daily life so ordinary that many people had never imagined it as fragile. In the hours that followed, attention turned from disbelief to a harder question. How could a bridge fail so completely, so quickly, under ordinary traffic conditions. Investigators would eventually trace the disaster to the fracture of a single eye-bar in a suspension chain, a small but essential steel component whose failure triggered the larger collapse. It was a devastating lesson in structural vulnerability. Sometimes the difference between stability and catastrophe is smaller than the public can see. And once that truth became clear, the disaster at Point Pleasant stopped being only a local tragedy. It became a national warning. In the days after the collapse, Point Pleasant and Gallipolis were forced into a reality that was both practical and emotional. The bridge had not only carried traffic, it had carried routine, commerce, family connection, and regional continuity. Its loss immediately disrupted daily life on both sides of the river. Commutes changed, business patterns changed, travel became longer and more difficult. But beyond those logistical problems was something less measurable: the psychological shock of realizing that a structure people trusted without thinking had failed in the most final way possible. For grieving families, the disaster remained personal long after it became historical. 46 deaths meant empty chairs at dinner tables, unfinished plans, and a holiday season permanently marked by absence. The collapse entered local memory not as an abstract engineering lesson, but as a wound attached to names, vehicles, and ordinary lives interrupted without warning. Nationally, however, the impact reached far beyond the Ohio River. The Silver Bridge disaster exposed serious weaknesses in how aging bridges in the United States were being monitored. Investigators concluded that the collapse began with the failure of a single eye-bar link containing a small crack, a defect that was difficult to detect with the inspection methods of the time. Just as important, the bridge's design had too little redundancy. When that one critical element failed, the structure had limited ability to redistribute the load. That combination changed American infrastructure policy. The disaster helped lead to stronger federal attention on bridge inspection, maintenance, and inventory programs. In the years that followed, the United States developed more systematic approaches to identifying structurally vulnerable bridges before they became disasters. So the Silver Bridge became something larger than a local collapse. It became a turning point in how America understood a difficult fact: infrastructure can look permanent long after it has become fragile. And that raises the final question this story leaves behind. What does it mean when a nation built on movement begins to realize how much of its safety depends on things most people never see? The Silver Bridge is often remembered for the moment it fell, but perhaps the more lasting part of the story is what it revealed before and after that moment. It revealed how easily people learn to trust what surrounds them every day: a bridge, a road, a tunnel, a dam. Once it becomes part of routine, it begins to feel less like a structure and more like a fact of life, something permanent, something beyond question. And in America, few things have shaped daily life more deeply than that quiet faith in infrastructure, the belief that movement will remain possible, that the path home will still be there at the end of the day. The collapse of the Silver Bridge forced the country to look more carefully at that belief, not with panic, not with spectacle, but with humility. Because this was not a story about a dramatic warning ignored by everyone. It was a story about ordinary people living inside an ordinary system, unaware of how much depended on parts too small to notice and failures too hidden to imagine. That may be why the disaster still lingers in American memory, not only because of what was lost, but because of what it said about modern life itself. That some of the most important things holding a country together are the things people rarely think to question. If you value real American stories that are quiet, haunting, and historically grounded, subscribe to Unseen America, because history does not disappear when people stop talking about it. Sometimes it is still waiting beneath the surface.